Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is drone photography for conservation, opportunities and obstacles. And it will be presented by our fabulous NatHab Expedition Leader, Charlie Reinertsen. Charlie, thanks again for being here today. Let's go ahead and dive in.
Thank you, Sunny, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm calling in from Saranac Lake in New York, in the heart of Adirondack Park. And this is kind of the playground for all of my photography pursuits over the last few years. And today I wanted to talk about one particular topic that I didn't really expect to be talking about over these last couple of years. I've been pursuing drone photography as a new aspect of my photography uh, efforts, and it's opened up this new realm of possibilities. And it also comes with a lot of challenges. So today's chat is going to talk about my progression in conservation photography and how different phases of my career and different topics that I've explored have led me to work with different types of gear, and how that's kind of a conversation with each other. And then we'll take a look closely at drone photography and some of the opportunities and obstacles, especially when you're trying to capture some of these wild places. There are a lot of considerations and concerns that come up to make sure that wildlife are not affected and that other people's opportunity to experience wild places isn't impacted by the use of drones. And then finally, we'll talk about why am I spending so much time trying to talk about and educate everyone about the ecosystem that's so near and dear to my heart, which is northern peatlands. But just to kick things off, let's take a look at my photography process, and in particular, how my different goals throughout different subject matter that I've been working on have informed the gear that I've ended up choosing. And part one starts with turtles. I was a researcher studying softshell turtles, and that allowed me to encounter some of these characters along the way in the Mississippi River watershed. And as a researcher, I was just excited about trying to share some of the encounters that I had with other people and try to capture the personality of these turtles. Not a lot of people are spending a ton of time with our Chelonian friends. That's the family name for turtles. And I felt like that was a little bit of a miss. And so I wanted to try and get some of the personality of the painted turtle, the snapping turtle, the softshell turtle through photography. So my big goal there was to capture moments that really communicate kind of a sense of playfulness or personality of these animals. And the major component of gear that I was using at the time was a macro lens. So a lens that allows you to focus at a really short distance from your subject, and that was kind of my first foray into photography. The second chapter of my career really landed in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And here I found just these incredibly large open landscapes and really dramatic wildlife. And it ended up informing the way that I approached photography. I was kind of drawn towards black and white images, definitely influenced by Ansel Adams spending time in this landscape. And I was always trying to create these kind of elegant images that were both beautiful and also had an edge to them that were kind of speaking to the raw beauty of this landscape. And a lot of times I found myself trying to isolate the subject from the background. So here, a trumpeter swan standing in this frozen water, and here a raven. And at the time, I was really drawn towards black and white, really high contrast in this type of image. But when I did use color, trying to again find ways to just create these really beautiful, pleasing images. that had a fair amount of kind of elegance behind them. And so in this chapter of my life, I was really using wide angle lenses for the landscapes, and then for the wildlife portraits to be able to isolate that subject matter, I was using a much longer lens. A 300 millimeter was the longest that I used. So that required a lot of patience in allowing the animal to be able to move through the landscape to be able to get close enough to photograph them, because that's really not a ton of reach in the world of wildlife photography. And at this point in time, I was trying to share the drama of these landscapes. And for me, that the challenge almost was that uh, you're in a place where there's so much open space. How do you create a composition that immerses you in that moment and captures kind of the drama of that landscape and those the wildlife that live there? So then I transitioned to the northern forests. I moved to the East Coast and lived in Massachusetts for a number of years, and was traveling all throughout New England to capture forest imagery for a number of different nonprofits at the time. And here I started to really focus more on, you're in the thick of the forest, and the forest in the northern forest is such an ephemeral place. Everything is always changing all the time. And so my photography really tried to start to capture these fleeting moments where all of a sudden the whole canopy of the forest is, in full fall color. Or there's this fleeting moment where you're starting to see a hint of fall happening. And so there are some elements of the first two parts of two chapters of my photography path, if you will, of using some macro photography to get detail shots, and then also stepping back and trying to get that larger landscape. In certain instances, I could kind of get that sweeping wide view that was reminiscent of some of the photos that I was taking out west. But by and large, this was kind of a more intimate photography approach, and color became really important to me at this time to be able to capture the feeling of those different seasons. So that, ultimately my goal of being able to capture that ephemeral nature uh, really ended up playing out as having a wide range of different types of lenses to be able to try and play with composition and color. And so that brings me to today's topic, really, which is diving into northern peatlands. And part of the conversation today is, why did I feel like this work uh, made me go into aerial photography and into drone photography? So up until this point, I'd always done all of my work by foot. And when I started working on this project, these ecosystems are just incredibly important, and we need to raise awareness of them and gather support behind them. And I'll talk more about why I'm doing this work a little bit later. But first, we'll talk a little bit about just the photography challenge of it. These places are very strange. They're not your typical landscapes. And so it's hard to wrap our heads around what we're even looking at. Here, if you're looking down at the lower portion of the image, you're seeing sphagnum moss that's deep, deep red, and then an assortment of different forbs and brush, different bushes growing up out of that sphagnum. And this whole landscape is actually basically submerged in water. And so you start to get a close-up look at some of the plants growing there, and it's very mysterious. These are pitcher plants. They're carnivorous plants that actually have this nectar that's attracting insects, and even snails and other small invertebrates. And those animals come and they drink the nectar, but it's laced with a toxin. And that toxin kind of makes those insects drunk, and they lose their ability to climb back out. And if you look closely at this image, there are all these down facing hairs on the surface of the leaf, and that traps the insect in the cavern of that modified leaf. And then ultimately, that nectar also has a substance that allows the plant to break down proteins over time, and that is how it gets some of its nutrients. And then it also has the ability to go through the process of photosynthesis. So these plants living in this place are wild. They kind of challenge our perception of what we know about the plant world. Here we're getting a close-up shot of some of that sphagnum. Sphagnum moss is a water-loving plant. It can hold up to 20 times its weight in water. It can be a wide variety of colors depending on the season and depending on the moss variety. And it is the building block for our northern peatlands. So as those mosses die, they get submerged, and over time, because it's submerged and the process of decomposition is slowed down so dramatically, you actually start to form peat. And we'll talk more about why peat is so important, especially from a climate solutions perspective. So this is the point in the process where I'm gathering these images and I'm starting to tell the story of these incredible places, but I just felt like it wasn't a full picture of what these places are like. So I was using all these different lenses to try and get different compositions and try and feature the different plants and the landscape. But my ultimate goal was to inspire peatland restoration and protection. And I didn't feel like I was getting past our current perception of swamps, bogs, and mires. When you think about a bog or a swamp, you think about biting, blood-sucking insects. You think about, in popular popular perception of bogs. Perhaps the audience today, you might think different things about these places because you might be informed about all the benefits that we get from our wetlands. But in history, in human history, we've drained these places. We're incredibly good at destroying these ecosystems, uh, and celebrating that as the progress of development. So I really was faced with this question of how can I challenge that perception of swamps, bogs, and mires? And that led me to, I need a different perspective. I need to show these places from in a new light where it doesn't feel like your feet are soaking wet and that you're being bit by bugs. Let's get an aerial perspective. And that's when this work really started to open up and started to explore new possibilities where I'm starting to be able to get images like this. And the power of an image like this is that it starts to make you ask questions where your first thought is, what am I even looking at? And then you start to look for clues around the image. You start to see, okay, on the right-hand side, it looks like that's a forest. Those are all trees. It's summertime. And then why am I getting all these colors on the left-hand side of the image? And what is this? Is that a body of water? What is going on? So this image was taken by drone, looking straight down at the landscape. And I've found that that's one of the ways that really starts to capture what's unique about these places, because they're really even beyond the outline of that spring, that pond in the very middle of this image. Everything beyond that leading up to the forest is incredibly wet, where if you were to step on the sphagnum moss that makes up the blanket of most of the plant composition surrounding that spring, you would sink into water immediately, just 2 inches below the surface of the plants. You would be getting wet feet. And so all of that is just this submerged, wet environment that creates this perfect habitat for plants who have adapted to be able to survive in exactly these ecosystems. So I've found that these images really grab people's attention and they start to ask questions and try to figure out what is going on with this image. Where was it taken? And for me, I kind of refer to this image as the grand prismatic of Adirondack Park, because if you can picture grand prismatic, it's that very dramatic spring with tons of different colors of the thermophiles in Yellowstone National Park. And to me, this image It's a landscape that hardly anyone knows about. It exists in our backyard here in the Adirondacks. And to me, it has all of those components of beauty and mystery and ecological story. And yet, we're not talking about it as much as some of these other iconic landscapes in the United States and beyond. And I think that we need to start talking about our peatlands more. Images like this help ground us a little bit more in what we're looking at. So here you're starting to see trees that are growing out of that sphagnum moss. All that you can see up until the forests in the background, that's all peatland. So those peat deposits of slowly decomposing organic material, they can be up to 33, 35 feet deep. So you could bury a 3-story building underneath there. And effectively, because of the slowly decomposing material, the water is highly acidic, and it kind of pickles the vegetation as it dies. And we have incredible stories of unearthing, different remains of animals and people historically in places in Europe. We talk about Viking culture and some of the burials that happened, and we're discovering bodies that have been perfectly preserved by this very strange and very different water composition and ecosystem. So there is that aspect of mystery in these places and intrigue, and it gets you asking all these interesting questions. But to me, this ability, and here's a video to be able to give a little bit more context, this ability to get above the landscape and see it from a new perspective really brings these places that we might think of as being harmful or not exciting to be able to explore, and it brings some of that excitement in my mind when I'm looking at these pictures. Here's another spring that is located on that same peatland. In the end, you're starting to get just a sense of scale for how large this peatland is. It's about 3 miles across and about 2 miles wide. And this is the second largest peatland in the state. And here's another video just getting a close-up of the spring that we were looking at in a previous image. And you're seeing all these patterns in the sphagnum where parts of it are red, parts of it are green and kind of a golden color. And those are just different species of sphagnum. And this is called a patterned peatland, where you actually have some hummocks and hollows. So hummocks are the raised areas that are a little bit more dry, and hollows are the wet depressions. Those are also called strings and flarks, as another name for those. Bogs have all this incredible terminology around them, names that we have for different aspects of them, and they're just our attempt to explain what's happening in these places. So let's dive into some of the challenges around drone photography, and there are a lot. The first one that comes up and is incredibly important for anyone thinking about doing drone photography are getting really familiar with the regulations. And thankfully, there's a commercial license that's required if you're going to sell your images or do any kind of commercial work or anything beyond just recreational use of drones. And getting that commercial license, you go through a test and you learn all of the different regulations that go along with being able to operate a drone. But I've pulled out some of the really important ones from those federal regulations. One of the big ones is that you can't fly above 400 feet above ground level. So if you launch at 1,000 feet elevation, you can fly up to 1,400 feet elevation, which is 400 feet above the level that you launched the drone from, or where the drone is in space. You also have to be aware of all the different airspace restrictions. So the federal government effectively regulates what objects can be operated in the air, which is referred to as the airspace. And the different airspace regulations exist at different heights above the ground. And these are the same types of airspace regulations that pilots have, but there are specific ones for drones, where drones can and cannot be operated. And there's a difference from where you can launch drones versus where you can fly drones. And in particular, you can't fly drones over people or over moving cars. And the huge one, especially for conservation photography purposes, is that you have to maintain visible line of sight on your drone at all times. The only exception to that is if you create a line of what's called visual observers and you're in communication, radio communication with those people, and someone on your team is able to locate and put eyes on the drone at all times. That is one of the ways of getting around and having the pilot need to have line of sight. But as you can imagine, if you're trying to capture a forest and there's no clearing or lake or anywhere to be able to get a long line of sight, you're not able to legally operate the drone. Thankfully, where I've been operating the drone is a peatland, and that is a vast area that's fairly treeless. And if there are trees, it's pretty stunted, so you can actually operate at a pretty good distance while maintaining visual line of sight. So those are a couple of the big regulations that you have to use as the guardrails for how you operate. Another big one is public perception. And this one is if you're operating in areas where you might encounter other people, those people will might come to the interaction with a prior conception of drone operations. And so if, for instance, the way that I'm getting these photographs is by flying from private land, so that the Nature Conservancy owns this entire peatland that I've been working in, and so I have permission from them to be able to go and photograph on specific days to be able to help promote the conservation of this land. And so I have paperwork that shows that I'm able to be there and what the purpose of this is. But you might still encounter some folks who rightfully don't want their hiking or experience of this landscape interrupted by machinery, which is effectively what a drone is. And there's also kind of a educational aspect of this of there might just be folks that are curious about what you're doing, and you want to be able to share kind of the different aspects of why you're doing it and what the regulations are and how you're being able to ensure that your operations are safe, and both for wildlife and for people who might be around. Another challenge is that often these places that photographers like myself are trying to capture prohibit drones. So a lot of our wild areas, especially in New York State, a lot of our forests in Adirondack Park are designated wilderness areas, which you cannot operate any machinery within those areas, and a drone counts as that. So there are many places that prohibit drones from launching from their land, but there you can also operate drones by launching from private land to be able to then fly over protected areas because it is a federally regulated airspace. And even that comes with ethical or just considerations to take into account. Because again, it's one of those areas where you want to operate, or at least I want to operate with the idea of the essence of the law and not necessarily the letter. And so, there are ways to operate legally to be able to access really deep wilderness areas. But there's also the question of how are we impacting those places, and is the goal or the intent of capturing that photograph worthy of being able to access that area. And another one of the challenges that comes with drones is just simply learning a new skill set. So before I went out into any place like this, I was just in my backyard developing skills around operating that machinery. to be able to both fly safely and also what's really important, especially in video work, is being able to fly smoothly and not jerky or changing direction while you're in the middle of a clip. Um, one of the biggest challenges for me in moving into drone photography after having spent 10-15 years in ground-based photography is just that the options for compositions are almost limitless, and it's hard to ground yourself and think about the different types of compositions you can make from an aerial photograph that help tell the story that you're looking for, and are actually compositions that are nice to look at. Because often when I first got into drone photography, the first few pictures that I took were terrible because your whole ability to kind of set yourself in the picture and be able to see the composition you want is thrown off by this new form of photography. Another challenge is just managing battery life. A lot of times these machines are only able to do 20 minutes, 30 minutes, or 40 minutes on a battery. And so you have many different battery sets to be able to have a longer time in the field, especially if you're in a backcountry location, which is usually where I'm operating from. And so between all these challenges, it is a considerable thing to be able to take on, to be able to try and start to dip into this. But at the same time, I really believe that my work on the Northern Peatlands project has been fundamentally changed and improved by my ability to get into the air and be able to get some compositions and just stories that wouldn't be possible otherwise. So the opportunity that this presents to me is to change our perception of peatlands and to help inspire conservation efforts. Uh, and here's what I was hinting at earlier. Why should we care about our peatlands? Here's a map showing the peatland distribution globally. You can find them everywhere in the world. They're pretty heavily distributed along the northern hemisphere, but you can find them in the tropics, in different areas. It only covers 3% of Earth, and yet it stores about 50% of Earth's soil carbon. So it has an incredibly large amount. That's twice as much of as our global forests. And in addition to the carbon benefit, they're also incredible biodiversity hotspots. So this is a list of threatened and endangered species. You can't read it, but you get the concept that there are lots of species who rely on these ecosystems to be able to survive. And because of those carbon stores, the peatlands are helping to keep our planet cool, and they're also filtering water and providing clean air and providing so many other ecosystem services. So they're really important. And just to get into that climate topic, how is it possible that our peatlands are keeping our planet cool? Well, that's going to take a little bit of peat 101, and this will be pretty brief. We've referenced this already. Peat is that organic material that's formed when plant material accumulates in a saturated environment. Here you're seeing a peat core, so on the top are living plants, and then the recently deceased plants, and then longer ago plants died and accumulated and formed what we call peat, which is formed in these wet conditions where it's not allowed to fully decompose. This just helps kind of break down that peatlands include fens, bogs, and mires, and then we have a lot of other words for very specific types of fens, bogs, and mires. And then wetlands encompass peatlands, marshes, and swamps. So just to kind of help wrap your head around the type of ecosystem that we're talking about. But how do they keep our planet cool? We have two pathways for climate solutions. We can reduce the emissions that we're putting out, and we can store more carbon. And to store more carbon, we can only do that through carbon sinks, which are natural climate solutions. So looking at land sinks and coastal and ocean sinks. And if we can store more carbon, we need to restore a lot of natural ecosystems that have been degraded. And one of those are our northern peatlands and our peatlands broadly. So if we can protect and restore our global peatlands, it will have a huge impact on our ability to store more carbon. So it's a 25.4 gigaton of carbon dioxide equivalent, which doesn't give you a huge perspective, but this is a list of over 100 solutions from Project Drawdown to be able to get to avoid emissions that would cause huge ecological collapse. And peatland protection is at the very top of one of the largest impact solutions that we have available. Peatlands continue to be degraded today for developing for agriculture, and where we are having forest fires, especially in Canada. We're seeing a lot of forest fires that are impacting peatlands and degrading them. And so far, we have about a loss of 15% of our peatlands. And if we can start to protect and restore those peatlands, we can start to see a shift in the climate equation. So it'll help. It'll also have all these add-on effects in addition to the climate benefits of being able to help prevent forest fires and be able to provide these havens for biodiversity. And that really led me to form the Northern Peatlands Project, which is trying to raise awareness of the northern peatlands, which is shown in this graph, which kind of represents about 25% of our total peatlands around the world. And I'm located here in Adirondack Park, which is kind of the southernmost extent of northern peatlands. And the place where I've been spending the most time is the Nature Conservancy Preserve's Spring Pond Bog, which is the second largest one in the state. And you can see it here where it's red in this sea of forests. And that's the sphagnum moss coming through in that aerial image from Google Maps. And this is just an image showing the location where I've been hiking out to be able to launch my drone with permission from the Nature Conservancy to be able to try and capture this landscape. And this shot in particular kind of helps paint the picture of the history of these places. They actually are kind of remnants of the most recent ice age, where when glaciers were melting off the landscape about 10,000 years ago, chunks of them broke off, were embedded in the landscape, and then as they melted, they left behind wetlands. Those wetlands filled with life, with vegetation that eventually started to fill up that water column as it died, and that's what started the process of forming peat. And so this is the location that has been a large part of the collection of photos that I've been putting together. And I'm trying to show this place season after season and capture some of the mystery and beauty of this landscape to try and raise awareness of how these ecosystems are just vitally important to our planet and also to all the animals that call them home. And this aerial perspective just helps so much. Here we're seeing the landscape view, and then I'm going to sit right on top of it with a drone to be able to see a different perspective of that same body of water. And I think it just it helps to paint a picture for what these ecosystems are like. Here we're seeing some wildlife trails on the left-hand side of the image. I've gotten back and processed images and discovered things like I've found, it was either a beaver activity or maybe muskrat or perhaps otter. I'm still working on trying to figure out who was spending time there, but especially in the videos, it's kind of uncovering different aspects of this landscape. And you can follow along with this work by going to twoline.com/tracks or by scanning this QR code. And I've been putting together a monthly publication to be able to share stories from our peatlands and photographs and video to try and transport people to these places and raise awareness about them. and hopefully inspire some folks to act on their behalf. A lot of these photographs that I've been showing and others that I haven't shown in this presentation are going to be on display in Old Forge, New York at the View Arts Center. On June 7th, there will be a gallery opening from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. And this will be on display from the end of May until mid-July. And you can also just check out the stories here, and I'll be talking a lot about the exhibit coming up. So if you would like to get in touch, feel free to email me, follow me on social media, and hopefully today you learned a little bit about why would drone photography be such a helpful tool in conservation photography. And I'd love to spend the remaining time answering a few questions as well. So thanks for tuning in.
Charlie, thank you so much. You do such a good job of weaving together all the important bits and saving us so much time. So thank you for teaching us all that you have learned. We have, let's see, we have time for questions. So before we start the Q&A, I just want to remind everybody that they can submit questions via the questions field in the control panel. Okay, we've got a bunch of good ones coming in already. Is it possible to zoom in with a drone camera?
Yeah, so in terms of drones, there are a lot of different types of drones on the market. Some of them have cameras that allow you to zoom. Some of them have fixed lenses on them. The camera that I'm using it's a DJI drone, and it uses Hasselblad optics. So it's got essentially effectively a 24 millimeter is the primary lens that I use, and it's a DJI Mavic Pro that I use, and it has 3 lenses associated with it, effectively like a 70 millimeter, a 50 millimeter, and a 24 millimeter. And I find that the processing that comes with the 70 and the 50 millimeter just don't have enough power for what I'd like. They're not super crisp and clean images. I really love the wide angle lens because it's a 4/3 CMOS sensor, which is not quite a full frame sensor that you'd want that I use with my digital mirrorless camera. But it gives really good clarity, really good depth of field, and it's just like it's a flying camera. So it's just equipped with whatever camera comes with that particular model that you choose. I used to have an Inspire 2, which is a much larger drone that has a detachable camera. And this new drone, the DJI Mavic 3 Pro, effectively replaced the Inspire 2 with optics, and yet it has this very small, like it's probably basketball sized body, and the camera itself is quite small as well. So yeah, long answer to your question. It's really often drones have built-in cameras, and all the different drone options from all the different manufacturers and providers have different cameras and optics associated with it. So it's a little bit of a world to step into and that you can get lost in. Yeah.
Interesting. Is sphagnum moss sold for orchid propagation, grown commercially, or is it taken from the wild?
Yeah, so unfortunately, all of the potting mix that has sphagnum within it is being harvested from the wild, and that's one of the ways that you can degrade a peatland. It's not as bad as draining a peatland and converting it fully to another ecosystem, but that is contributing to degradation of peatlands. Yep.
Okay. Do drones ever disappear due to malfunctioning, and how do you get it back since it's lost a lot of useful data?
Yeah, so there's a heartache that comes with drones. So drones have the ability to malfunction. It's a piece of equipment that can go. There are a lot of moving parts and a lot of technology that goes into it. You can have what's called a flyaway event where you lose control of it and it just is gone. Oftentimes, these drones are coming with essentially the ability to geolocate them. So you have your remote control that's connected to your drone. And even in the event of losing control of the ability to fly the drone, you can locate where it is. But if your drone is over a body of water when that happens and it happens to malfunction, then you're out of luck or go scuba diving. And a lot of these companies you can buy into their care protection plan so that in the event that you crash the drone falls out of the sky, any number of things happens, depending on the coverage that you have, you might be able to replace it for no or low cost. But most of those require you to be able to get the drone back. For me, operating as a business through my business Two Line Studio, I carry limited liability insurance for the operation of the drone. And then I mitigate risk by looking at all the different aspects of where I am. Thankfully for this ecosystem, there's relatively low impact in terms of when I've operated out there, haven't seen one single person on the trail that I'm on or around. It's entirely owned by one entity, and there are no other trails accessing this area. And so from a mitigation of risk of flying over people, there's no risk there, essentially. But there are considerations of making sure that if I do see wildlife on the landscape, that I'm not impacting their behavior. And there's a lot of research going into using drones to monitor wildlife activity and what animals may or may not respond or react to drone operations, even to the point of testing the frequency of the sound of the rotors on these machines and whether certain drones with certain frequencies affect wildlife behavior more than others. But for me, in this instance, I'm not looking for close-up shots of animals. And for the most part, when I'm operating in the daytime, animals are largely not present in this ecosystem where I'm operating the drone. They might be more in the forest or bedded down in the sphagnum moss. So kind of a long and roundabout answer to your question, but hopefully that answered some of what you're looking for.
Is there a limit to how close to the ground the drone can get?
Most of the drones have obstacle avoidance software built in. And it essentially, you can choose on your settings to have that stop the drone or make the drone avoid that obstacle. You can manually turn that off, and then you're running at a risk that if you don't operate it properly, that you could crash. So you could operate a foot off the ground, and you can also change so you're operating it with a joystick, right? Two joysticks for the full range of motion, and how hard you press forward on those joysticks correlates to how fast the drone moves in response to that. It's like a video game. And you can adjust the settings so that by pushing full forward, it only goes a really slow speed. So for me, I have done some limited videography where I'm really close to the ground, but I'm moving incredibly slowly, and almost nothing that I could do on the controls is really going to cause a crash. So you can operate them really close to the ground, but if you're close to the ground, the power of the rotors spinning can cause some of what you're looking at to move. So like if you have leaves or branches or things on the ground, if you're pointed straight down, you're going to notice the power from the rotors hitting the ground, just the wind. And same thing for flying across water. But if you're pointed forward, and it's not too wide of an angle of a view, then you wouldn't necessarily have any impacts there to your image. Yeah.
Okay. How much damage can a drone do to a commercial aircraft, and what are the ramifications?
Well, that's a great question. So that's part of the federal regulation of maintaining below 400 feet, and then also visual line of sight. So drones are always uh, giving right of way to all other machinery or anything else. So drone operations are secondary to everything else, right? So if I'm operating a drone, I'm always listening for any kind of disturbance, whether it's hearing a person or hearing a plane go overhead. And if there's a plane in the area at all, I just bring it down to either landing or, that I can see that it's within 20 feet off the ground, and wait for that plane to move out of the airspace and then operate again. And the other piece of it is that the vast majority of the time, you don't want to be at 400 feet. That's the most that you can be above ground. And even then, you're likely not in the pathway of many planes. Um, uh, but most of the shots that are good are taken closer to the ground, really, because once you get up high enough, the resolution of the image kind of falls apart. You start to get atmospheric interruption. So the risk, if you're being thoughtful and you're being aware of your surroundings, and also choosing strategically where to launch your drone, um, being aware of what might be around in the landscape, can all be helpful things, so that you should never have uh, any kind of a crash like that happen.
Sounds good. Well, that is the last question we have today. So I will turn it back to you for closing comments.
Well, thanks for tuning in today and having a little bit of a different conversation than we typically do. Keep an eye out. I'll be doing a number of presentations over the spring and summer, and diving into different ecology topics, including our peatlands. So thanks for tuning in, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks again, Charlie. We really appreciate you. I also want to thank everybody who tuned in today. Please join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.